Hey, good day. Welcome or welcome back to this series of Performing at Your Best. Throughout the last couple months, I have been recording the key principles, perspectives of human performance, no matter what your performance area might be, whether it's playing a violin or playing soccer or doing dirt bike racing. Performance is performance. In the 100 level series of this, we had 14 separate videos that hopefully those of you that were interested in the big picture of human performance would view in order from the 101 all the way up to the 114 videos. In this 200 level series, we're emphasizing specific practices. So feel free to skip around or even skip some that may not apply to you and go to the ones that you would want to apply to you. In the 202 volume of this video series, I talked about your self-talk and how to transform the negative self-talk, the put-downs, transforming those into pull-ups, which are called affirmations. And I gave you a whole system of how to make that transformation. Go to the 202 if you haven't already done so. Since I recorded that video, I came upon just the neatest quote about self-talk. Remember, if you viewed that, I said that the Aussies and the Kiwis always talked about that little voice in their head, as they would say. And those are always the little doubts, the little chipping away that you're not worth it, you're not worthy, you're not good enough. That's what the Aussies say to it. Since then, I came upon a wonderful quote from the Quakers. And the Quakers used the same phrase, those little voices in your head. They said the Quakers use that phrase to talk about your inner wisdom, your intuition, and even being in touch with your best natures. I really like that. So if once you make that transition into transforming that negative self-talk into positive self-talk, you can start tapping in better to your intuitions and your better natures. Here's what we're talking about today. It is something we all do naturally, and it's something that you can do a little more formally to mentally rehearse your performances. We do it naturally, that we dream about our performance area of those rare times when we have a peak performance or our A game where everything just meshes together, that seems to be effortless, yet you have ultimate control of everything in minute detail, where time slows down, where your awareness expands. Those are just wonderful times. A lot of those rare opportunities are based on previous successful practices and performances, and all of those can be grounded in how you mentally rehearse these practices and performances. It is something 130 years ago that Carl Jung said it was creative daydreaming. So it is natural, it is normal, and it's even necessary that before every rehearsal, before every performance, before every practice, before every workout, hopefully you're spending just a couple minutes mentally rehearsing what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. Here are a couple things. Way back in the first volumes of this series, in volume 112, when I talked about purposeful practice, we talked about neuroscience and how we learn things and better retain things. Then that was in volume 112. If you haven't viewed it or want to view it again, is that every practice should have a goal and the means to achieve those goals. That's your tactics. Also, though, before those practices, mentally rehearse multiple times how you're going to do those practices. Not only what to do in what order and what sequence and what to emphasize, but how you're approaching it as a person, as a performer. And the more you mentally rehearse that what happens, remember from that first video, is that the specific neurons that were associated with stimulating that area for performance or for practice. The more you stimulated those, the more they would reverberate with the hippocampus, that mechanism way deep within ourselves. And the more we rehearse that, the more we strengthen that connection between the hippocampus, where there's a long-term memory, to the specific neurons. So those synapses, those connections become stronger or heavier through the reverberations of just practicing. Now, some old jocks, as opposed to an athlete, some old jocks would be sleeping before or during a practice and say, I'm mentally practicing, coach. No, they're not. But the people who actively mentally rehearse before and sometimes during, at different breaks, during a rehearsal or a practice, as well as the performances, are actively engaging themselves, and they're strengthening what they want to do and how they want to do it. Here's the good news. And this is one of the first facts that came out from the emerging science of neuroscience from the 1980s. And that is the basal parts of your brain and your central nervous system cannot distinguish between those that are being very specifically mentally rehearsed and those things that are actually happening. Ponder that for a second. Most of your brain and your central nervous system cannot distinguish between those things that are being very vividly, particularly mentally rehearsed, versus those things that are actually happening. Some of the original research was done with bodybuilders about them mentally rehearsing, them contracting their biceps, for example, without moving. And what was happening, those fine motor neurons associated with their biceps were actually firing. Those of you who ever heard stories of a person hallucinating through mental illness or some kind of illicit drugs would be yelling and running down the hall that there's a pink elephant chasing them. In their brains, in their bodies, it was actually a pink elephant chasing them. Your basal parts of your brain and your central nervous system cannot distinguish between those things that are being very impactfully mentally rehearsed versus those things that are actually happening. So then when you mentally rehearse things, you are putting yourself, most of your brain and all of your central nervous system into those situations where you're actually doing those things. So think of it as that you're gaining experience without the practice, without the sweat. Those supplement the regular rehearsals as a prelude to it. And here's something we'll talk about in a future video. After the performance, before you walk away from the performance area, sit quietly and mentally replay what you did and mentally replay how you did it. That helps lock in, or what neuroscience call anchoring what you learned and how you wanted to learn it. So mental rehearsal is not only good before the practice or before the performance, they're especially helpful after the performance. Think of it, your brain as a big old-fashioned videotape machine, and that what you're doing is rehearsing the things on the videotape, what to do, going through you, and afterwards you are splicing, you're mentally replaying those things that you really wanted to do, what you learned, and what you accomplished, and you're anchoring those as well. So mental rehearsal comes before and after the performance or practice, and sometimes during the performance, during timeouts or breaks in the action. It is that important. The more you purposefully mentally rehearse beforehand, the better and more anchored those neurons will be, so that your best self will come out more consistently and at higher levels. One of the things to remember from that video 112 is that each of us has a neurological orientation where we're more predisposed to perform and practice in specific ways by either remember, visual by nature, auditory by nature or kinesthetic by nature. You have probably figured out already, I haven't used the word so far, visualization. Visualization is a wonderful tool of mental rehearsal, and it's only appropriate for the 60% of us who are visual by nature. Visualization does not work as well with the 20% that are auditories and the 20% that are kinesthetics. That's why I use the broader concept of mental rehearsal. Granted, for the 60% who are visual in nature, can you visualize yourself in that scene? Can you feel yourself in that scene? Can you be not only an outside director, if you will, of your mental movie? Can you be and see yourself as an active participant? Visuals will work on their mind's eye of seeing things more clearly, more in 3D in dimension, and more brightly. And the more they enhance those visual images of brightness and clarity and even focus, the more those mental rehearsals in terms of visualization works. If you're not a visual and are one of the 20% that are auditory, you can still mentally rehearse your performances beforehand and mentally rehearse them by feeling your emotions, listening to what is happening. Is it a sound of your piano? How does that sound play out? If you're a baseball player, can you hear the whoosh of the bat? If you're a golfer, can you hear the whish of the swing of the club? Here, that is your anchoring of your auditory self. If you are a kinesthetic person, the best ways to mentally rehearse are in terms of rhythm and in terms of balance. Can you mentally rehearse yourself feeling centered, feeling grounded, feeling stable? And then can you feel and sense the rhythm or the timing or the tempo of everything connected? Can you feel yourself in balance? So no matter your neurological orientation, visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, create those scenes in your mind's eye, visually or auditory or kinesthetically. Maybe more importantly, that when you mentally replay your performances after a practice or after a performance, to anchor those things in, this is where your neurological orientation really benefits you. After the performance, if you're a visual, visualize what you saw. Visualize how you accomplish things. If you're auditory, mentally replay what you heard about people complimenting you, about the sound of your breathing or exertion, and what you had heard. If you are kinesthetic, mentally replay what your body felt like to be in rhythm or having fine motor skills or having a sense of balance. That's where those things are really anchored for the next time. Does this make sense? I hope so. Whenever you mentally rehearse something, there are two dimensions of that. Mentally rehearse the process by which you're doing it, and then mentally rehearse the positive outcome of it. Mentally rehearse the process of it, the steps, stages, sequences, transitions of it, and then mentally rehearse in great detail the positive results of that. If you are rushed or in the midst of a timeout, if you had to choose just one under time pressure, just mentally rehearse the results of it. Before you go to the practice field, before you go to the recording studio, before you go and warm up, spend time in great detail with your mental rehearsals, visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, looking at all the steps, stages, sequences, the process. Along with that, Mentally rehearse the process of the qualities you want to exude, those positive qualities of yourself as the performer that you want to exude in this process. That could be feeling relaxed. That could be learning how to concentrate deeply and fully. That could be feeling calm or poised or joyful or ecstatic. Mentally rehearse those qualities. That's a part of the process too. And then mentally rehearse what the desired positive outcomes could be, replaying these things. For example, when I used to work with very good bowlers, and I brought up this notion of mentally rehearsing the process, a lot of them said, yeah, I know what to do. That's part of my pre-bowling routine on each shot. I said, that's good. That's good. But also, what things did you want to do, emphasize during the process of your qualities? And they start thinking, well, I want to be confident. I want to stand upright. I want to be in balance when I release the ball at the foul line. So those are more specific things. I want to feel the ball go off my two fingers. And so they really rehearse those things based on their neurological orientation. During a game of bowling, then, when it was almost their time to go up again, what they would just mentally rehearse was the positive outcome. If you're a right-hander, you want to see and feel and hear that ball entering the 1-3 pocket. If you're a left-hander, you want to see and hear and feel that ball going into the 1-2 pocket. The more you, and then all the pins crashing and exploding all together, the positive results of that. So make sure you emphasize the process, the steps of what you're doing, how you're emphasizing it, as well as the personal qualities you want to exude, and then also mentally rehearse the positive outcomes. Here are some general steps, particularly if you have time before or after a rehearsal or practice. You have to start from a base of relaxation. Relax, breathe, learn how to be centered deeply within yourself. That's when you're most at ease. And that's where all the connections of your neurons are firing most radically, not when you're extremely exhausted or critical about yourself or stressed out. Relax. Go deeply into yourself and center yourself. Then, whether you're visual or auditory or kinesthetic, create the scene in your mind's eye that you want to rehearse in great detail with all of your inner mental senses, your inner mental sense of colors or sounds or textures or fragrances, or even taste, as much as you can. Create the scene of you performing. Are you in front, sitting down at a piano? How does it feel on that stool? The black ebony shined piano, the white and black keys. As much detail as you can. Feel if the keys are cold or warm to your touch. Smell the sensation, especially with violinists and cello players. When they rosin up their bowl, they can smell the rosin. As much as you can in your mental inner senses, create the scene you want to mentally rehearse, either visually or auditorily or kinesthetically. Then be in that scene. Feel yourself, see yourself, sense yourself in that scene. You are the participant of that scene. Then be very specific in playing out the sequence of that scene. Keep on repeating, refining your rehearsals. Each time you do a rehearsal before the same physical rehearsal or practice or performance, they'll be a little bit different, and that's good. Learn how to make the time. That's the most important time you can do. Sometimes some athletes can do their mental rehearsals as they are warming up, as they're stretching, but that is at advanced levels. At the beginning, if you're mentally pre-playing something or afterwards mentally replaying something, spend time with yourself just doing it. If you're sitting in the car, sitting in the corner of a rehearsal studio, sitting in a locker room, somewhere, find time to do it by yourself. Hopefully, this is not as complicated as I may be coming across with it. Here's also some things to mentally rehearse too before important performances. Most of you have heard this great philosopher by the name of Mike Tyson that said, everybody has a game plan until they get whomped in the face. Yes, we can also do our mental rehearsals of how to be more adaptive and responsive and flexible during the performances. Not everything is programmed in yourself to play out in a specific way. So sometimes before a performance, spend some time creating what's called if-then scenarios. If this happens, then I will do that. If that person does that as my opponent, then I will do this. For example, if you are a second baseman in baseball or softball, and there's a runner on first, and the ball is hit to the shortstop, where are you going? Of course, you're going to second base to cover the throw, and hopefully pivoting around gracefully or leaping the air gracefully to throw the base runner out at first as well. If-then scenarios. I once had the opportunity to work with some Top Gun pilots who wanted me to help them become better with their golf. And where Top Gun is now in Western Nevada, we would meet at a local golf course there. And these are hot shots. They're as much as of a fabulous people as you saw in the movies, Top Gun movies. And they wanted to know how to translate that stuff that they've learned in the cockpit with the heads-up displays onto playing a round of golf. And so we worked on those things. And then we talked about the distinction between reacting and responding. This is more than a semantic wordplay. When you are reacting, you're physically or literally on your heels. You didn't anticipate that happening. And when that happens, your brain is having to sift through all the shock of it, and it responds to something in 3/4 of a second to a second and a half before you start moving in action. If you have been ready to respond to something, if you played out these if-then scenarios ahead of time, your brain would be firing in 1/4 second to a half second. Doesn't seem like much. It means a lot to those Top Gun pilots. So they're constantly looking at if-then scenarios. If this happens, I will do that. So if you're performing and there's some kind of distraction or disruption happening that is unanticipated, program that. If this baby cries in the audience, I will continue to stay calm and composed and focus on what I am doing. Play out these if-then scenarios so that you can learn how to respond as opposed to react. All of these contingencies you are actually programming into your mind so you can be more flexible and more adaptive. You'll tend to be less surprised by things that pop up, and there will be a sense of pride of that to you saying, hey, I did respond well to that. I handled that unanticipated situation really well. Yeah, I got whopped in the face and I learned how to respond to that. As you're seeing, this whole notion of mental rehearsal as mental pre-play before a practice or performance, including mental replay after performance, customized to your own neurological orientation of being visual, auditory, or kinesthetic. That's where you create what's best for you. You become more and more effective and more efficient, so that when you go into your performance arena, whatever it might be, you are ready to act, ready to respond, and ready to become more fully involved. Keep on experimenting with your mental rehearsals. Find your own system of mental rehearsals. Tweak it, rely on it, and use it many times. What happens then, there's that reverberation going on between your hippocampus and those motor neurons associated with great, fluid, successful performances. This is Tom Kubistant. I shall see you for the next video.